All right, you ready for the long lesson? This is the video that's going to take some time, in which we have just a lot of terms to go over because extracting and converting energy is pretty complicated, but we do have a lot of terms related to this because we're going to start talking about classification. And honestly, this is one of the ways that we split organisms into groups. And anytime we split organisms into groups, we're going to have a lot of terms related to how we're splitting organisms into groups. I would say that none of this is that complicated, although some of it might be a little difficult to keep straight. So this is where you might want to start getting your note cards ready, start making flashcards for yourself to help you learn some of the terms related to biology. And let's get started. So all living things have to extract and convert energy. Why do they have to do that? Well, in order to do the things that they need to do to be living things. So we talked about how living things are made of DNA. We're exploring how they have to extract and convert energy, and they do that because they need to have energy to sense and respond to changes in their environment and to reproduce. That all requires energy. Okay, and not just any kind of energy, it requires very specific energy that's not so much energy released so fast it'll destroy an organism, it'll actually burn the organism up. It has to be very controlled, slow release energy that accomplishes very specific purposes. And that's what living things are able to do. So organisms have to have some kind of a strategy for getting energy. In this slide, we're just going to talk about strategies for getting energy. And we're going to talk a lot more about the processes by which organisms actually break down energy in later units. But I'm going to mention some terms related to the processes by which organisms break down energy. The next three terms are going to be about that. All right, then first of all, we have the general term related to the breakdown of energy, the breakdown of matter to release energy. That's really what this is, metabolism. And it has a really complicated definition, okay? The sum total of all processes in an organism, which converts energy and matter from outside sources and use the energy to sustain the organism's life function. Let's just break this definition down, okay? So all organisms need to get energy from their surroundings. And they're going to do that by doing something. They have some strategy to take in energy from their surroundings. We're going to talk about lots of strategies. So I can give you an example of a strategy: eating. Eating lunch is a strategy for getting energy from your surroundings. That burger that you have is in your surroundings, and you are going to consume it and get that energy into you. That's what we're talking about with metabolism. It's the process by which you convert energy and matter from the outside to your energy or your arrangement of matter inside you. Okay? That's metabolism. There's two types of metabolism. They're the other two terms. One of them is anabolism. Anabolism means that you're using energy from the outside to build larger chemicals and structures inside you. You're actually taking that energy and incorporating it into your body structure so that you're making the structures of your body, or you're making stored energy that you're going to use for later. And honestly, those two are very similar to each other. So if you're storing up energy in fat molecules inside your body, that's anabolism, because you're taking simpler molecules and putting them together to make fat that you can then burn later. When you burn that energy later, you're going to be breaking down more complicated molecules, and that's called catabolism. So it's the sum total of processes which break down larger chemicals to produce energy and simple chemical building blocks. All right, so catabolism is related to the word catastrophe. In a catastrophe, everything seems to break down, right? If you can remember catabolism and catastrophe, that might help you to keep straight which one is catabolism and which one is anabolism. This is when you break down larger chemicals to produce energy. Really, so the really important thing that you need to realize here, when you make complicated large chemicals, it takes energy to do that. When you break down complicated large chemicals, it releases energy. And that's what's important to realize here. All right, let's talk now about some of the strategies by which organisms actually do anabolism and catabolism. What are some strategies by which organisms get energy from their environment into themselves? The first we're going to talk about photosynthesis. It'd be really nice to have the ability to photosynthesize, wouldn't it? Just stick out some fronds and get energy from the sun. Humans can't do that. We need to eat other organisms in order to get our energy. But plants generally, and there are some other organisms that aren't considered plants that are able to make energy from sunlight. Okay? So this is an anabolism, right? An anabolic thing where green plants will take simple chemicals and energy and they store up that energy as they produce their own food. Now plants actually create a huge amount of food for themselves, and then they use that food through catabolism to actually break down energy from it. So anytime plants build up their structures, and you see plants grow and grow and grow and grow, what they're doing is they're storing up food in their structures through photosynthesis, and then they can burn up that food that's in their body structures later on. But that's what photosynthesis is, making energy from the sun. All right? Most organisms that you think about when you think of living things, like you think about plants as living things, obviously, because plants are living things, but most of the time people think about animals as living things. Those animals don't make their own food. They have to get food from elsewhere. And we have some categories that we break those organisms down into. Herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. Carnivores are organisms that eat only organisms other than plants. So you might think of a zebra, for instance. Zebra would be an organism that eats plants on the African savanna. And then a lion would eat the zebra. A lion would be a carnivore that eats only meat. It's designed to eat only meat. And then omnivores are organisms that eat both plants and other organisms. There's actually lots and lots and lots of omnivores. Human beings are a classic example of an omnivore. But there's lots of examples we can classify: true herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Also, another classification system we'll talk about here is autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that produce their own energy. Heterotrophs are organisms that depend on other organisms for food. And if we want to split that a little bit further, we could talk about producers, consumers, and decomposers. Here's another way that we could categorize organisms by what they eat. Again, producers and autotrophs are really the same thing, organisms that make their own food. Heterotrophs, though, in this case, are broken down into two different groups. Consumers are organisms that eat living producers and other consumers. So from up above, consumers would be herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Those would all be examples of consumers. And then decomposers are organisms that break down the dead remains or waste of other organisms. They get their energy from energy that other organisms treated as waste, basically. And then, by the way, without decomposers, we'd be in a lot of trouble, because anytime something died, it would just remain in the environment. There wouldn't be anything to break it down. Decomposers serve a hugely important role in the environment, is that they break down dead matter and then turn it back into basic nutrient-rich matter that living organisms can use once again. Usually producers use it. Then consumers eat the producers, they die, the decomposers break down the consumers, and they turn the consumers back into rich, nutrient-dense material that more producers can use, and there's a cycle there. It's probably important for us to spend a few moments talking about classification, because classification is a huge thing we do in biology, and it is putting organisms into groups. And you'll see in boxes at the bottom of the slide, I have 3 different classification systems. The first one just classifies types of consumers. The last one classifies producers, consumers, and decomposers. In that bottom one, we actually have a place to put plants and like mushrooms and fungi, right? So does that make the bottom one better? Well, not really. It really depends on what we're trying to classify. Maybe we're just trying to understand the flow of energy through the different consumers in the food chain. And then that top organization system would be just fine. If we need to be a little more broad and include all where the energy comes from for a food web, we would probably use the bottom classification system. So we're going to classify things many different ways. Sometimes we'll have overlapping classification systems like these ones here. And a lot of the terminology in biology is going to be related to the way that we classify organisms and put them into groups.